In the small, sleepy town of Maplewood, life usually moved at a slow and predictable pace. People greeted each other warmly at the local grocery store, kids played in the park after school, and everyone seemed to know each other's business. But one crisp autumn morning, something happened that would shake the entire town to its core. It all started with Mayor Richard Hargrove, a man known for his strict but fair leadership style. He had recently introduced a new set of rules aimed at making Maplewood look cleaner and more presentable. These rules weren't exactly popular among some residents because they came with hefty fines for anyone who didn't comply. One of these rules focused on keeping homes neat and tidy. No overgrown lawns, no chipped paint, and no clutter outside houses. If someone broke this rule, they'd be fined $500 per day until their property met the standards. At first, most people grumbled, but followed the rules. They mowed their lawns, painted their fences, and made sure everything looked picture perfect. But there was one person who couldn't keep up, a woman named Evelyn Johnson. She lived alone in a modest house on the edge of town, surrounded by tall trees and wild shrubs. Her home wasn't messy inside, it was clean and cozy. However, outside, things were different. The garden was overgrown, the porch railing was broken, and the paint on the walls was peeling badly. City inspectors noticed Evelyn's house almost immediately. They sent her letters, warning her to fix the problems or face consequences. Evelyn tried explaining her situation. She worked long hours as a nurse's aide at the nearby hospital, caring for patients day and night. After losing her husband, 2 years ago, she had been struggling financially. Between paying bills and putting food on the table, fixing her house just wasn't possible right now. But the warnings kept coming. Every letter reminded her of the growing fine, $500 per day. It didn't take long before the amount reached an astonishing $8,000. For someone like Evelyn, who barely made ends meet, this number felt like a nightmare. Word spread quickly through Maplewood about what was happening. Some people sided with the mayor, saying he was only doing his job and that everyone needed to follow the rules. Others felt sorry for Evelyn, whispering behind closed doors about how unfair the whole thing seemed. The tension grew thicker as days passed. Neighbors debated over coffee and during evening walks. Was it really right to fine someone so heavily when they clearly couldn't afford it? Shouldn't exceptions be made for special cases? While opinions clashed, Evelyn stayed quiet. She didn't want to cause trouble or draw attention to herself. Instead, she continued working hard, hoping against hope that things would somehow work out. What no one realized back then was that Evelyn's story ran much deeper than anyone could guess. Behind her calm demeanor lay secrets that would soon change how everyone viewed her and themselves. Little did the townsfolk know, their peaceful little community was about to become the stage for a drama that would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about fairness, compassion, and justice. As the days went by, the pressure mounted. Reporters began showing interest in Evelyn's case, turning her private struggle into a public spectacle. Cameras appeared outside her house, and strangers knocked on her door asking for interviews. Evelyn avoided them as best she could, retreating further into solitude. Yet, even as she tried to hide from the world, the storm brewing around her refused to die down. And so, Maplewood stood divided, waiting to see what would happen next. No one suspected that the truth lurking beneath the surface would not only shock them but also force them to confront uncomfortable truths about their own humanity. The courtroom was packed that morning, buzzing with anticipation. People from all corners of Maplewood had gathered to witness the hearing between Evelyn Johnson and Mayor Richard Hargrove. Some came out of curiosity, others out of concern, and a few because they wanted to see justice served, though what justice meant seemed to depend on who you asked. Evelyn sat quietly at the front, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wore a plain blue dress, one she'd owned for years, and her face was tired but calm. It was clear she hadn't slept much the night before. The weight of the $8,000 fine hung over her like a storm cloud, and though she tried to stay composed, her eyes betrayed her fear. This wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, fairness, and whether anyone would truly listen to her side of the story. When her name was called, Evelyn stood up slowly, almost hesitantly. Her voice trembled as she began speaking, explaining her situation to the judge and everyone else in the room. She talked about her late husband, the man she'd loved deeply, and how his passing left her not only heartbroken but also struggling financially. She mentioned her long hours at work, caring for patients who often couldn't care for themselves. And then, with tears welling up, she admitted that fixing her house simply wasn't something she could afford right now, not when rent, groceries, and medical bills already stretched her thin. "I'm doing the best I can," she said softly, looking directly at the judge. "I don't have family here to help me, and I've been trying to keep my head above water. If you give me more time, I promise I'll fix everything. Just please, don't take my home away." Her words tugged at the hearts of many in the room. A few people exchanged glances, some nodding sympathetically, but not everyone felt moved. Mayor Hargrove, seated across the aisle, listened without expression. When it was his turn to speak, he rose confidently, his tone firm and unyielding. "Rules are rules," he declared, scanning the crowd as if daring anyone to challenge him. "We introduce these ordinances to improve our community, and exceptions cannot be made. If we start bending the rules for one person, where does it end? What message does that send to others?" he went on, emphasizing the importance of accountability and fairness. To him, this wasn't personal. It was about maintaining order and ensuring that everyone followed the same standards. His argument resonated with some attendees, especially those who believed strict enforcement was necessary for progress. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure if they agreed but unwilling to argue against someone as authoritative as the mayor. The judge listened carefully to both sides before delivering his verdict. After a brief pause, he announced that Evelyn would indeed need to pay the full $8,000, or risk losing her home. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and Evelyn's shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world had crashed down on her. She didn't say another word, just nodded silently and walked out, clutching her purse tightly. Outside, reporters were waiting. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward her, and questions flew rapid fire. "How do you feel about the decision? What will you do now? Do you think this is fair?" Evelyn stopped for a moment, her eyes red from holding back tears. One reporter pressed harder than the rest. "Do you believe justice was served today?" For a long while, Evelyn didn't answer. She looked around at the sea of faces staring back at her, searching for understanding or empathy but finding little of either. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what justice is anymore." Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving behind a stunned crowd. As Evelyn disappeared into the distance, the reporters dispersed, eager to file their stories. But inside the courthouse, conversations continued to simmer. Some people whispered angrily about the mayor's lack of compassion, while others defended his stance, insisting that rules existed for a reason. Few noticed the young journalist lingering near the exit, jotting notes furiously in a worn-out notebook. Something about Evelyn's response had struck a chord with him, a sense that there was more to her story than met the eye. Back at her house later that evening, Evelyn closed the door behind her and leaned against it, letting out a deep sigh. The day had drained every ounce of energy she had left. She glanced around her living room, taking in the familiar sights. The worn couch, the framed photo of her smiling husband on the wall, the stack of unpaid bills on the table. For a moment, she allowed herself to cry, releasing the frustration and helplessness she'd been carrying for so long. But even as she grieved, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over yet. Deep down, she knew her fight wasn't just about saving her home. It was about proving that she mattered, that her struggles weren't invisible, and that kindness still existed somewhere in the world. Little did she realize, forces beyond her control were already stirring, preparing to bring her hidden past to light. Meanwhile, the town of Maplewood remained divided. Conversations buzzed in coffee shops, grocery stores, and parks. People debated passionately, each side convinced they were right. No one suspected that Evelyn's quiet resilience masked a history far richer and more complicated than anyone could imagine. And soon, the truth would come tumbling out, forcing the entire town to rethink everything they thought they knew. The days following the courtroom decision brought a wave of emotions that swept through Maplewood like a storm. Evelyn's story had struck a nerve, and it wasn't long before the town found itself divided. Some siding with her, others standing firmly behind the mayor. But what started as quiet murmurs soon grew into something much louder. People began organizing protests outside City Hall. Signs popped up everywhere, held high by neighbors who felt the fine was too harsh. "Justice for Evelyn," read one sign, while another simply said, "Fairness over fines." The protesters came from all walks of life, young and old, rich and poor, people who didn't even know Evelyn personally, but were moved by her plight. They gathered in growing numbers, chanting slogans and demanding change. Inside City Hall, Mayor Richard Hargrove watched the scene unfold with a mix of frustration and unease. He hadn't expected this level of backlash. To him, enforcing the rules was about maintaining order and ensuring the town looked its best. But now he faced an angry crowd that refused to back down. Reporters camped outside his office, asking questions he didn't want to answer. Even some of his closest allies were beginning to question whether he'd gone too far. Meanwhile, Evelyn stayed out of the spotlight. She avoided the protests, preferring to keep to herself. Friends and neighbors knocked on her door, offering help or just wanting to check on her. Some brought groceries. Others offered to mow her lawn or fix her porch railing. But Evelyn politely declined every offer. "I don't want to burden anyone," she would say, her voice soft but firm. Her reluctance puzzled many. Why wouldn't she accept help when she clearly needed it? Was she too proud? Or was there something else holding her back? People whispered among themselves, speculating about why Evelyn seemed so guarded. There was an air of mystery surrounding her, a sense that they didn't know the full story. That curiosity only deepened when snippets of Evelyn's past began surfacing. No one knew exactly where the information came from, but bits and pieces started making their way around town. Someone mentioned seeing old photos of Evelyn in uniform. Another recalled hearing rumors about her serving overseas years ago. At first, these tidbits seemed like harmless gossip, but as more details emerged, they painted a picture that left people stunned. It turned out Evelyn hadn't always lived in Maplewood. Before moving to the small town, she'd led a very different life, one filled with sacrifice and bravery. Neighbors pieced together fragments of her history, how she'd once been part of something bigger than herself, how she'd risked her life for others, and how she'd returned home bearing scars, not just physical ones, but emotional wounds that never fully healed. These revelations sparked a mix of awe and guilt among the townsfolk. Many felt ashamed for not knowing sooner, for assuming Evelyn was just another struggling widow without looking deeper. Others grew angrier at the mayor, convinced that if he'd known about her background, he never would have pursued the case so aggressively. As the whispers spread, so did the movement to support Evelyn. Fundraisers sprang up overnight. Local businesses donated supplies, while volunteers organized cleanup efforts aimed at fixing her property. Social media played a big role too, with posts about Evelyn going viral. Hashtags like #WhyDoStandWithEvelyn trended locally, drawing attention from neighboring towns and even national news outlets. Despite the growing momentum, Evelyn remained hesitant. She appreciated the kindness pouring in but couldn't shake the feeling that accepting help would make her vulnerable in ways she wasn't ready for. For years, she'd kept her past hidden, burying painful memories under layers of silence. Now those same memories threatened to resurface, forcing her to confront parts of herself she'd rather leave buried. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Evelyn sat alone on her porch, staring at the overgrown yard. She could hear voices in the distance. Protesters still gathered downtown cheering for her name. It was surreal, almost overwhelming to think that strangers cared so much about her. Yet instead of comfort, she felt a pang of sadness. All this attention should have made her feel supported, but instead, it reminded her of how isolated she'd been for so long. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Reluctantly, she got up and opened it to find a young journalist standing there, clutching a notebook and a camera. He introduced himself politely, explaining that he'd been researching her story. Evelyn tensed, unsure whether to trust him, but something about his demeanor put her at ease. A sincerity in his eyes that told her he genuinely wanted to understand. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he assured her. "I just want to tell your truth, the whole truth. You deserve that." For a moment, Evelyn hesitated, then slowly she nodded and invited him inside. As they sat across from each other at her kitchen table, she began sharing pieces of her life, things she hadn't spoken about in years. Her voice wavered at times, and tears occasionally slipped down her cheeks. But as she talked, a weight lifted off her shoulders bit by bit. By the time the interview ended, Evelyn felt drained but also lighter, as if she'd finally let go of a secret she'd carried for too long. The journalist promised to present her story accurately, vowing to honor her courage and resilience, and though Evelyn didn't know it yet, his words would soon ignite a chain reaction that would change Maplewood and her own life forever. Outside, the protests continued, fueled by determination and hope. Inside Evelyn's home, however, a quieter revolution was taking place. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she didn't have to fight alone, a future where her sacrifices might finally be recognized, not just by others, but by herself. The young journalist didn't waste any time. After spending hours listening to Evelyn's story, he knew he had something powerful on his hands, something that could change the way people saw her, and, more importantly, themselves. He spent the next few days digging deeper, piecing together fragments of Evelyn's past and verifying every detail she had shared. It wasn't easy. Some parts of her history were buried under layers of time and secrecy. But slowly, the full picture began to emerge. When the day came for him to reveal what he'd uncovered, the entire town was holding its breath. A large crowd gathered at the community center, where a hastily organized town hall meeting had been called. The room buzzed with anticipation as people filled the seats, eager to hear what the journalist had discovered. Even Mayor Hargrove attended, though he looked uneasy, shifting in his chair and avoiding eye contact with anyone. Finally, the moment arrived. The journalist stepped up to the podium, clutching a stack of papers and a folder filled with old photographs. His voice trembled slightly as he began speaking, but it quickly steadied as he launched into Evelyn's story. "Many of you know Evelyn Johnson as a quiet woman who lives on the edge of town," he started. "But what you don't know is that before she moved here, she lived an extraordinary life, one marked by courage, sacrifice, and heroism." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Decades ago, Evelyn served in the military, not just as a soldier but as a medic, a role that required immense bravery and skill. She deployed overseas multiple times, risking her life to save others. During one particularly dangerous mission, her unit came under heavy fire. Despite the chaos around her, Evelyn stayed calm and focused, pulling injured comrades to safety and treating their wounds under fire. Her actions saved dozens of lives that day." The room fell silent. People leaned forward, hanging on every word. The journalist held up a photograph, an old faded image of Evelyn in uniform, standing tall and proud. Her eyes in the photo were confident, almost fierce, a stark contrast to the reserved woman everyone knew today. "But her service came at a cost," the journalist continued. "Evelyn sustained serious injuries during that mission, both physical and emotional. When she returned home, she faced challenges most of us can't even imagine. Discrimination within the ranks made her transition to civilian life even harder. She struggled to find work, to heal from trauma, and to rebuild her life. Eventually, she moved to Maplewood hoping for peace, a fresh start away from painful memories. By now, tears were streaming down the faces of many in the audience. Some clutched each other's hands, overwhelmed by the weight of what they were hearing. Others sat frozen, unable to process how much Evelyn had endured without ever saying a word. "And yet," the journalist said, his voice cracking slightly, "despite everything she went through, Evelyn never stopped giving back. She became a nurse's aide because she wanted to continue helping people, even when the world hadn't always been kind to her. She works tirelessly, often putting others' needs above her own. And still, she carries the scars of her past. The injuries that make tasks like property maintenance nearly impossible. He paused again, looking out at the crowd. So when we talk about fairness, when we debate rules and fines, let's remember who we're talking about. Let's remember Evelyn's sacrifices, not just for our country, but for humanity itself. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of sniffles and muffled sobs. Then, slowly, applause began. It started with a few hesitant claps, then grew louder and more thunderous until the entire room erupted in cheers. People stood up, tears streaming down their faces, showing their support not just for Evelyn, but for the values she represented. Mayor Hargrove sat motionless, his face pale. He hadn't known any of this, no one had. The revelation hit him hard, forcing him to confront the consequences of his actions. For weeks, he'd insisted on enforcing the rules without exception, believing it was the right thing to do. Now he realized how wrong he'd been. This wasn't just about property codes or fines. It was about recognizing Evelyn's humanity and honoring her sacrifices. As the applause died down, Evelyn herself entered the room. She hadn't planned to attend the meeting, but neighbors had gently persuaded her to come. When she walked in, the crowd parted to let her through, their eyes filled with admiration and respect. Evelyn looked around, visibly shaken by the outpouring of love and support. She took a seat near the front, her hands trembling as she tried to process what was happening. The journalist finished his presentation by urging the town to take action, not just for Evelyn, but for anyone else who might be struggling silently. "Let's use this moment to reflect on how we treat each other," he said. "Rules are important, yes, but so is compassion. Let's make sure our community reflects the best of who we are." When he stepped down from the podium, the mayor approached Evelyn hesitantly. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by humility and regret. "I'm sorry," he said softly, extending his hand. "I had no idea. None of us did." Evelyn stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "It's okay," she whispered. "We all make mistakes." Her forgiveness stunned everyone, including the mayor himself. Here was a woman who had every reason to hold a grudge, yet she chose understanding over anger. In that moment, Evelyn became more than just a symbol of resilience. She became a beacon of hope, reminding everyone that kindness and grace could heal even the deepest wounds. Outside, the community center, the protests transformed into celebrations. People hugged strangers, shared stories, and vowed to do better moving forward. Fundraisers gained even more momentum, with donations pouring in from across the country. Volunteers lined up to help repair Evelyn's home, determined to restore, not just her property, but her faith in humanity. For Evelyn, the night felt surreal. She had spent years hiding her past, convinced that no one would care or understand. Now she found herself surrounded by people who genuinely loved and respected her, not because of what she'd done, but because of who she was. It was overwhelming, humbling, and beautiful all at once. As she drove home later that evening, Evelyn couldn't help but smile. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen, not as a struggling widow or a forgotten veteran, but as a human being worthy of love and dignity. And though challenges still lay ahead, she knew she wouldn't face them alone anymore. The days that followed the town hall meeting were unlike anything Maplewood had ever experienced. What started as outrage and division transformed into unity and action almost overnight. The revelation of Evelyn's past stirred something deep within the hearts of the townspeople, a mix of guilt, gratitude, and a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in years, neighbors who barely spoke to each other came together with one common goal: to lift Evelyn up and make things right. Mayor Hargrove wasted no time in addressing the situation publicly. Early the next morning, he held an impromptu press conference outside City Hall. Standing beside Evelyn, he issued a heartfelt apology, not just to her, but to the entire community. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I let rules overshadow compassion, and for that, I am deeply sorry. Evelyn deserves better, not just from me, but from all of us." He went on to announce that the $8,000 fine would be waived entirely, but that wasn't all. He pledged funds from the city budget to repair Evelyn's home, ensuring it met not only the required standards but also reflected the dignity she deserved. "This isn't charity," he emphasized. "It's justice, and it's long overdue." Evelyn stood quietly beside him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked smaller than usual, almost overwhelmed by the attention. When reporters asked how she felt about the mayor's apology, she simply smiled faintly and said, "People make mistakes. What matters is what we do after we realize them." Her words carried weight, resonating far beyond the crowd gathered outside City Hall. As news of the mayor's decision spread, volunteers poured in from every corner of Maplewood and even neighboring towns. Contractors offered their services for free, while local businesses donated materials like paint, lumber, and tools. Neighbors showed up daily to help with the renovations, rolling up their sleeves and working side by side. Some brought food and drinks to keep everyone fueled, turning the project into a communal effort that felt more like a festival than hard labor. For Evelyn, watching this outpouring of kindness was both heartwarming and surreal. At first, she tried to stay out of the way, feeling uncomfortable being the center of attention. But as the days went by, she found herself drawn into the spirit of the work. She began chatting with volunteers, sharing stories, and even laughing, a sound many hadn't heard from her in years. Slowly, she allowed herself to lean on the people around her, realizing that accepting help didn't mean weakness, it meant connection. One particularly touching moment came when a group of high school students arrived to repaint Evelyn's porch. They'd organized themselves after hearing her story and wanted to contribute in their own way. As they worked, they peppered Evelyn with questions about her time in the military, fascinated by her bravery. Evelyn answered patiently, her eyes lighting up as she recounted memories she hadn't revisited in decades. By the end of the day, those teenagers weren't just painting a house. They were building a bridge between generations. Meanwhile, the movement inspired by Evelyn's story began to ripple outward. Town meetings became forums for discussing broader issues, like how to support veterans and low-income families struggling to maintain their homes. Policies once seen as rigid and impersonal were reevaluated, with input from residents who now understood the importance of flexibility and empathy. Mayor Hargrove, eager to redeem himself, took an active role in these discussions, often consulting Evelyn directly for her perspective. "Evelyn taught us something important," he told a reporter during one interview. "Rules exist to serve people, not the other way around. If we lose sight of that, we've failed." Evelyn, however, remained humble throughout it all. Despite the newfound admiration and respect she received, she continued living her life much as she always had, quietly, modestly, and with unwavering grace. She still worked long hours at the hospital, caring for patients with the same dedication that had defined her military service. But there was a noticeable change in her demeanor. The weight she'd carried for so long seemed lighter now, replaced by a quiet joy that radiated whenever she smiled. The transformation of Evelyn's home mirrored the transformation happening within the town itself. What was once a dilapidated structure surrounded by overgrown shrubs became a symbol of hope and resilience. Fresh paint brightened the walls, new railings adorned the porch, and flower beds bloomed where weeds had once grown wild. On the day the renovations were completed, the entire town gathered to celebrate. There were speeches, laughter, and plenty of hugs, all centered around Evelyn, the woman whose courage had brought them closer together. But perhaps the most profound change occurred within Evelyn herself. For years she had kept her past hidden, believing it was irrelevant to her present life. Now she realized that sharing her story hadn't diminished her strength, it had magnified it. People didn't see her as broken or burdened anymore. They saw her as a hero, someone who had sacrificed so much yet continued to give selflessly. That recognition gave her a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. As the sun set over Maplewood that evening, Evelyn stood on her newly repaired porch, gazing out at the crowd below. Her heart swelled with gratitude. not just for the physical changes to her home, but for the emotional healing that had taken place within her and her community. She knew challenges would still come her way, as they did for everyone, but for the first time in a long time, she faced the future with hope instead of fear. And so what had begun as a tale of conflict and injustice evolved into one of redemption and reconciliation. Maplewood wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was learning. Through Evelyn's story, its residents discovered the power of compassion, the value of listening, and the beauty of coming together to support one another. In doing so, they didn't just restore a house, they rebuilt a community. Weeks turned into months, and Maplewood continued to change in ways no one could have predicted. Evelyn's story didn't fade away after the initial wave of attention. Instead, it planted seeds of transformation that grew deeper with time. The town wasn't just different on the surface, it was different at its core. Evelyn herself became a beloved figure in Maplewood. Once a quiet, reserved woman who preferred solitude, she now found herself at the center of community life. People stopped by her house regularly, not out of pity, but because they genuinely wanted to spend time with her. Neighbors invited her over for dinner, shared updates about their families, and asked for advice on everything from gardening to dealing with tough times. Evelyn, who had spent years feeling invisible, suddenly realized she mattered to a lot of people. Her newfound visibility also opened doors she hadn't expected. Local schools began inviting her to speak at assemblies, hoping to inspire students with her story of resilience and service. At first, Evelyn hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something she enjoyed, and reliving parts of her past still stirred up emotions she'd rather keep buried. But eventually she agreed, believing it might help others understand the importance of kindness, perseverance, and standing up for what's right. When she walked into her first school auditorium, the room fell silent. Hundreds of young faces stared back at her, curious and eager to learn. Evelyn took a deep breath and started talking, not just about her military service or the struggles she faced when she returned home, but about the lessons she carried with her through life. She spoke about finding strength in vulnerability, about how asking for help isn't a sign of weakness, and about the power of forgiveness, both for others and for oneself. By the time she finished, the entire audience was on their feet, cheering and clapping. Teachers wiped away tears, and students lined up afterward to thank her personally. Some even asked if they could write letters to veterans or volunteer at local shelters. Evelyn left that day feeling lighter than she had in years. Knowing her, words had sparked something meaningful in those kids. Meanwhile, the changes in Maplewood weren't limited to Evelyn. The town itself felt like a different place. Conversations around fairness and compassion became commonplace. People started paying closer attention to their neighbors, noticing signs of struggle they might have overlooked before. A family down, the street whose roof leaked during heavy rains. Neighbors pitched in to fix it. An elderly couple unable to shovel snow off their driveway. Volunteers showed up every winter morning without being asked. Even Mayor Hargrove underwent a remarkable shift. Gone was the stern, unyielding leader who prioritized rules above all else. In his place stood a man determined to make amends, not just with Evelyn, but with the entire community. He worked tirelessly alongside residents to draft new policies that balanced accountability with empathy. Fines were replaced with warnings and support programs, ensuring no one would face the kind of hardship Evelyn endured again. One of his proudest achievements was establishing a fund specifically for veterans and low-income families needing assistance with housing repairs. Dubbed the Community Compassion Fund, it quickly gained traction, with donations pouring in from across the region. Evelyn played an instrumental role in shaping the initiative, offering insights based on her own experiences. Though she never sought recognition, the mayor insisted on naming her as its honorary chairperson, a title she accepted reluctantly but wore proudly. As spring arrived, bringing warmer weather and blooming flowers, Maplewood hosted its annual town fair. This year, however, things felt extra special. Stalls were set up along Main Street selling homemade goods, crafts, and delicious food. Live music filled the air, and laughter echoed through the streets. At the heart of it all stood Evelyn, sitting behind a table where she signed copies of a small booklet compiled by the journalist who'd uncovered her story. Titled Strength in Silence, it chronicled her journey, from her days in the military to her battle against adversity in Maplewood. People lined up for hours to meet her, clutching their copies of the booklet and sharing their own stories of struggle and triumph. Evelyn listened patiently, nodding and smiling, making each person feel seen and valued. By the end of the day, her voice was hoarse, but her spirit soared. She realized that her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who found hope and courage in it. That evening, as fireworks lit up the sky, Evelyn stood near the edge of the crowd, watching quietly. Someone tapped her shoulder and she turned to see the mayor standing there holding 2 cups of hot cocoa. He handed one to her and smiled sheepishly. "Thought you might need this," he said. "You've earned it." They stood together in comfortable silence, sipping their drinks and taking in the scene around them. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Evelyn broke the quiet. "Do you think we'll ever get everything perfect?" she asked softly. The mayor chuckled. "Probably not, but I do think we're getting better. And maybe that's enough." Evelyn nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. Perfection wasn't the goal. Growth was, and Maplewood had grown in ways she never imagined possible. In the weeks and months that followed, Evelyn continued living her life much as she always had, but with a renewed sense of purpose. She remained active in the Lide community, volunteering at the hospital, mentoring young people and advocating for policies that supported those in need. Her presence reminded everyone of the strength that comes from vulnerability and the beauty of human connection. Maplewood, too, kept evolving. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was learning. Through Evelyn's story, its residents discovered the power of listening, the value of empathy, and the importance of coming together to lift each other up. What had once been a divided town transformed into a tight-knit community bound by shared values and mutual respect. And so, Evelyn's journey came full circle. What began as a tale of conflict and injustice ended as one of healing and unity. Her courage had ignited a movement that touched countless lives, reminding everyone that behind every struggle lies a story worth hearing. And sometimes, the truth has the power to change hearts forever.